All right, and now I'm going to share my screen for a second. Actually, I'm going to share my screen for several seconds now that I think about it. So before I share my screen to show you on Canvas what the new arrangement is like for your discussion boards, did that make sense? I mean, was that clear enough? It's a pretty long explanation, but are there any questions about that? All right, looks like I did a good job of explaining myself then. If you have questions, of course, please ask. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen now. And I'm just going to show you, I have not made all of the changes yet, but I just changed module number 1. And what I want you to see is that from now on, although there are 2 links here, and there might end up being 2 links in the rest of the discussions, the point is that from now on, there'll only be 1 link for your significance statement, and then for your comment on someone else's significant statement in your team. And so the way this works is you will first of all make a reply, or you'll make your answer on Wednesday or Tuesday night at 11:50, by Tuesday night at 11:59 p.m. And then by Friday at 11:59, you'll reply to someone else's. So what will happen is that this page will start populating with a bunch of posts, and you'll read through them, and then you will simply pick one that you comment on and talk more about significance. Okay, so if you think about it, then this is trying to get you guys to think about bigger questions and why things are important and how they apply. You can really have fun with this. It might be a little bit uncomfortable for you at the start, as it was for me when I was first introduced to this concept. But this is, you know, I'm asking you guys to kind of think instead of just answer a question. So I appreciate the work you guys did on Friday, but I think I very poorly designed that, and I like this design much better. And we'll do it for 3 or 4 weeks, and then I'll probably do a survey and see what you guys think. I don't really want to change it, but if it's just a dud, then, you know, we might have to do something. I will also be monitoring these. So, you know, I'll be kind of checking out your work too. Again, I don't, you know, you guys, you write 100 or a couple hundred words, that ought to be plenty. All right. If you write more, that's fine. If you write fewer, I suppose that's fine. But you know, you can't say much in 100 or 200 words, but by the same token, we don't just want to drone on and on and on. We want to be efficient and get to the point. Okay. Now, does anyone have any questions on that? All right, let me say one more thing on bookkeeping matters, and that is I diligently tried over the weekend using the instructions that were sent to me by an instructional designer to create permanent breakout rooms in Zoom. I know it can be done, but after like 3 hours of trying to actually figure out how to do it and get it to work, I couldn't. So I'm going to have to talk to an instructional designer today. So today, we won't be able to do our breakout rooms, which is fine. But I just want you to know that we are working towards that. And I suspect that by Wednesday, what will happen is we will meet, and then I'll send you to your breakout rooms. And then after 10 minutes, we'll come back together. Okay. So note also that I made team assignments. I put that up on the website or on Canvas. And just since we're here, might as well go there just in case you haven't looked at it. And here are the teams. Those are the people on your team. You find your name and you find your other people. And then what I suggest you do is that you create a Google Doc. And to find other people's email addresses, you just go to people and you can find it here. Okay? So it's completely up to you whether or not you do that. But that's how you would do it if you were going to do it. All right. Are there any questions on any of that stuff? All right. Before we get to today's focus questions, then I'm going to regale you with a nice little PowerPoint that I've put together that illustrates some of the things that we're talking about here. Some of the pictures may be a little bit pixelated, for which I apologize. But nonetheless, I want you to see some of what we're talking about. And for those of you that haven't seen it ever, let me just say that my own opinion of some of these things that we'll be looking at is that they are among the most beautiful in the world. I have never in my life seen anything as exquisitely powerful and profoundly impactful as, for instance, St. Basil's Cathedral on Red Square at any time of any day. I've seen it in the snow, I've seen it at night, I've seen it in the early morning, I've seen it in the summertime. It is exquisite every time I see it. And I remember the first time I saw it, I just about fell over. I had an idea, of course, what it would look like, but when I first saw it, the first time I went to Red Square, it was just incredible. So I want to just kind of go through some of these pictures that, see what's going on here. Oh, what is going on? Huh. Well, that's weird. I wonder why the pictures aren't there. What the hell? Huh. Well, maybe I'm not going to do it. Huh. That is so weird. Huh. Never had that happen before. I wonder if it's the share. I'm going to unshare my screen for a second here. Huh. Oh, well, let me see here. Let me close it out. Go back in. You guys are going to see how unorganized I am. Or maybe you'll be impressed. I don't know. You guys will know how to steal my shit from my computer if you can ever break into it, that's for sure. Huh. So weird. All right, let's try this again. All right, voila. All right, you may recall from, oh shit. I didn't share my screen, did I? All right, let's try this one more time, see if it works. There we go. All right, so in your last reading, you may recall that the Peter Paul Fortress was the first kind of building built early on when Petersburg was built. And this is it from the air. This is not the Neva here. This is a little river on the back side of it. On the other side of it, which is to say on the bottom, past the bottom of the picture, would be the river Neva. And that can be seen up in this picture here on the right. So you can see that the Neva River is a very large river. Interestingly, it freezes every winter, and I've walked across it in March of '96. It was a weird kind of thing because it was starting to thaw, and there were cracks, but the ice was still 6 or 9 or 10 inches thick, so you could walk on it. But that was kind of goofy. And then this picture, which is just a little bit pixelated, is of course a picture of the inside. Now, keep in mind that these are pictures taken now, and it didn't look like all of this. It didn't look like this necessarily, in the early 1700s. And as I'll point out, it wasn't really till the 1740s and 50s that Petersburg really started to build up in stone, as it were. But these are some of the impressive sights and things that were mentioned in the your first reading. This is the so-called Admiralty here, which kind of forms I don't know what you'd call it, a vector in the city or a part of the city center. Eventually 3 main avenues would be built out triangularly from the Admiralty. You can see some of the ornamentation on the Admiralty here. And of course, you can see some of the ornamentation here. You can see the various kinds of figures that were, statues and so forth that were put there. And of course, you can also see the brilliant colors as far as that goes. You'll remember the story of the stone, the 660,000 kilo, as I recall, which turns out to be about 1.5 million pounds. The stone that was dragged to this site. This is it. And this, of course, is the rather strange but impressive statue of Peter the Great, the bronze horseman. And then here, of course, is a picture of St. Isaac's Cathedral. I'm not sure when St. Isaac's was finished, but it's pretty old. And of course, you'll recall that the columns for St. Isaac's Cathedral, which actually are out in front of it, you can't see it in these pictures. You'll recall that those columns too were carved out of granite and had to be transported to Petersburg. And as rudimentary and as, I don't know, basic as the technologies that the Russians had, it is nonetheless impressive that they managed to do this stuff. And, it's not like they had a crane that they could just pick this stuff up and move it with. This was hard work. And of course, as you'll recall, tens of thousands of serfs worked on building the city, and we cannot know how many lost their lives, but I've seen numbers as high as 200,000 serfs having essentially been worked to death to build St. Petersburg, which is why, in part anyway, Petersburg has this kind of ghost-like quality to it. And you'll read about that, from time to time. It's already been mentioned in the textbook, but, Petersburg's a beautiful place and it's an important city, but how shall we say it? It cost Russia to build it. This is the Menshikov Palace. This is the back of it on the right. And this is the front of it on the right, and this is the back of it on the right, on the left. And your book points out that by the 1740s, these palaces started to pop up under Elizabeth's reign. It is true that Peter demanded that his aristocrats, that his nobility, build palaces, but remember the Sheremetyev Palace, the first one, Boris Sheremetyev's palace, built in 1710, 1711, 1712, it was not much more than just a wood dacha, a wood building. And so, again, I want you to appreciate that though Petersburg did appear kind of out of nowhere, it didn't appear quite as fast. And it didn't even necessarily appear under Peter's reign. Peter was dead when a lot of this construction took place. But of course, Peter is credited for having decreed that the city be built. And so even after he was gone, the building of the city kind of still was attributed to him in that sense. And so these facades then were purposefully ordered by Peter. He essentially ordered that when these palaces would be built, they would be built along the Neva and other rivers in Petersburg, and that's why Petersburg has such a remarkable feel. And there are, of course, dozens of these kinds of palaces in Petersburg to this day. We'll be talking more about icons later. I just wanted to throw a couple up for you. Notice in your first reading, icons are referred to as kind of flat, two-dimensional, as it were. There's a reason why they're two-dimensional. Basically, Russian iconography is implicitly saying to you, you can't come in this picture. You don't belong here. The flatness has a purpose. The flatness says to you, no, you can't come in. And it says other things, but you can see both the stylized nature of it. None of the faces look natural, hence stylized. And of course, the flat two-dimensional nature. That's not to say that they're not impressive. They are very impressive. They are great works of art. But they are icons, and they have a certain kind of look and a certain kind of feel. And though there is iconography in Western Europe, these are Eastern Orthodox icons, and it's important for us to recognize that. This picture, unfortunately, is a little bit pixelated when I expanded it into this show, but this gives you a sense of kind of Muscovy, of Moscow, of kind of ancient Moscow. Now, Moscow's not the oldest city in Russia, but it has been the capital for a very long time. It lost its capital status and then regained it. But the point is, been around for a long time. But I just kind of want you to get a sense of what old Moscow looked like when Peter, for instance, in the 1690s or by the 1690s, had already decided that he wanted to get the hell out. And it was the old Russia that he wanted to get away from. These are some of the so-called Kremlin churches, that is to say the 9 churches within the walls of the Kremlin, just for you to get an idea of the beauty. We'll be talking about these, the architecture as we go along. Notice that this is one of the towers that go along the wall of the Kremlin here, this green thing. And these are they're just exquisite architectural examples. They're just really breathtaking. And this is the picture up in the right is the most clear. It's the most focused. It's the least pixelated, I guess. But this is, of course, St. Basil's Cathedral, which would be built between 1553 and 1558. The architect, I forget his name, after he finished it, had his eyes poked out. And the reason they poked his eyes out is because they never wanted him to build anything as exquisite as this again. It was built in honor of recent military victories in the expansion of Russia, in particular military victories over the Mongols, over the relatives of the Mongols, over certain khans and khanates, if you will. And we'll get to that story, but just want you to see the kind of exquisite nature. This, of course, is Red Square here. Kremlin is off to the right. Now we're kind of shifting to the Sheremetyev Palace. This is today's reading. Again, remember that this is not what it looked like in 1710 or 1711. This is what it came to look like over the years. But the Sheremetyev Palace, or Fontanka, or the Fountain House, will remain a central figure, a central theme in our story all the way throughout the book. And I just want you to get a sense of the impressive beauty of it, both inside and out. And this here picture on the bottom row, the one in the middle, is actually it's a monument. It's a museum presentation of Anna Akhmatova's office. And Anna Akhmatova, one of the great Russian poets of all time, but certainly the 19th and 20th century, Akhmatova would end up living in the Fontanka during the Soviet period for reasons that will be explained to you. It's an interesting place, and it's an interesting story, and Figes will be using it as a recurring theme in our story. Here are the Sheremetyevs that are spoken about in today's reading. Boris here, that's the old man. He's the one who was Peter's, confidant. This is Pyotr Sheremetyev, his son. And then this, of course, is Nikolai Sheremetyev, who marries Praskovia, all right? Notice, by the way, that these are also pictures done by, well, this one here is done by Ivan Argunov. Does anyone remember who Ivan Argunov is in our story? That's a question to the class. Nobody remembers, or nobody wants to speak up, or you didn't do your reading. I hope it's not the third. Argunov is one of the serfs. One of the serfs from the Sheremetyev family, or I should say from the 200,000 Sheremetyev serfs who were trained to be world-class artists, architects, carpenters, etc. You guys read about that. And we'll be talking about that today, but anyway, just kind of wanted you to get a picture of that. The boyars are frequently mentioned in the reading, but not really fleshed out. These, of course, were the service nobles before Peter, who were privileged and given their privilege by the previous czars. And they really aren't that important to our story because they are essentially gone from our story. Sheremetyev himself is kind of the last of the boyar class. And of course, Peter wanted to do away with the boyar class, and he did. These are the people that he Europeanized, for lack of a better term, right? Made them change out of their kaftans and their Asian clothes and made them wear European clothes and build European palaces and learn to speak French and all of that kind of stuff. But he also kept them subjugated, like they were subjugated before, so that their wealth and their power, notice, emanated from him. It emanated from the state. They did not personally own their wealth, in other words. It was a way for them to be subjugated and to remain subjugated. And of course, they could be punished. And as you will see, many of them were. And they could lose their status, and some of them did. This is one of the two palaces, Ostankino, that the Sheremetyevs owned outside of Moscow. Ostankino would be the one to which Pyotr and Praskovia would move when they got tired of the other one. But again, this just kind of gives you a sense of the kind of building that took place. And this is the theater at Ostankino. where all of those great ballets that we'll read about and operas that we'll read about took place. Very impressive. And I just want you to know that all of this detail and all of this craftsmanship, as far as I know, was done by Russian peasants who were trained at the highest level to do this kind of work. It's very, very impressive. This is the other palace, Kuskova. And you can see its exquisite nature here in the detail in this hall. And I'm not sure that this is the pond that's mentioned where 50,000 people could watch fake naval battles, right? But it might be, all right? And so just, you know, see that these Sheremetyevy's would bring 50,000 people onto their property. The wealth that these people had was massive. In fact, the Sheremetyevy's were the richest family in Russia. By the way, the international airport in Moscow is called Sheremetyevo, right? After the Sheremetyevy's. Look at these parquet floors, just amazing. Here's some of the palaces built by Elizabeth in the mid-18th century. Here is the Winter Palace. Inside, the main stairway, or one of the main stairways. Oops. This is the outside of the Winter Palace, which, by the way, has been built 4 times. It's burned down a couple of times, right? So again, it's not original necessarily. But by the mid-1700s, certainly by the 1800s, these were absolutely, completely impressive. This is Tsarsky Selo, which was built, I believe, by Catherine outside of Petersburg as a place where she could go and others could go. And then, of course, this is a picture of Pyotr. This is a picture of Praskovia. And then I just wanted to have one more example here for you of work by Argunov, one of the Argunovs. This is a famous painting of Catherine the Great. All right, so I hope that was interesting to you and useful to you. Let me get to one more thing. Why is that up there? Nope. All right. So finally, we get to discussion. Now, as I say, normally we will have 10 minutes of these. We're working with these questions with our breakout rooms. But today we won't. So we have 20 minutes or so. The history of the Sheremetyev Palace on the Fontanka is a microcosm of the Petrine plan to set down Western culture on Russian soil, according to Figes. Using the Sheremetyevy's, explain this Petrine plan and how it played out. All right, who wants to go? Nate Morgan, take a shot.
Okay, give me 1 second. Gotta close the door. Hold on. Sorry. Okay, so what I wrote, I guess in its entirety, was the plan to Europeanize Russia was a vast undertaking, but the
it was what?
A vast undertaking.
Yeah. Okay.
But the transference from the boyars and noblemen and aristocrats with strict codes of conduct was a reformation of a whole new understanding. With the Sheremetyev family being transformed, beginning with, I wrote Pyotr, my apologies, it was Boris,
all right.
Into nobles. The family had begun amassing their wealth according to their land ownership. Figes compared the palace and the lives to the Sheremetyev to European palaces such as Versailles. Later, it's explained that the Sheremetyevo Palace under Pyotr had attained many European arts and entertaining theater. And the palace itself was meant to invoke enlightenment in those residing in and around the castle or estate, possibly including those who may visit from Western Europe or around.
Okay. All right. Let me see here. Jacob Leach, what do you have to add?
And let me find it.
Or comment on Nate's stuff. He did bring out some good points there.
I generally agree with it that the modernization was a really big step forward for the Russians, and I guess the Sheremetyevo were really the strong leadership types that could make it possible.
What do you mean by strong leadership types that could make it possible? What do you mean?
They were, I guess, capable, and they were able to, get the. How do I want to explain it? I'm sorry, I'm really tired. I guess it's like they were able to. I don't know how to explain it. They weren't ineffectual, I guess, basic point. Yeah, I don't know where I'm going with that.
Joe Jackson? Shoeless Joe
Hello?
Jackson? I bet you've heard that before, right?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. So,
Add to what Nate and Jacob have said.
I think it shows like a big shift from, like you said, the old boyars, where they didn't really have any power. They couldn't control anything, so they never set any roots or anything. They lived pretty much like the serfs, like it described.
No. Let me stop you on that. The boyars had power. So the boyars had power. And they were, they were relatively rich too, but not in the scale that the Sheremetyevs would end up. I mean, the boyars essentially ran the country too. So let's be clear on that. They had power and influence, but Peter didn't like their old ways.
Mm-hmm.
So let me ask you this, Joseph. How drastic of a change did Peter require, and how would this have been experienced by these elites?
Well, it was really different from what they had. They were so isolated from Europe, and he just thrust them right into like the middle of it, and it was really fast.
Okay, Joe, you said they're isolated from Europe. What do you mean by that?
They didn't really have any contact with like traditions and their culture of European ways. Like it was there. A lot of them were isolated from it and didn't follow this European thought of like how noble should be, what it means to be a noble, I guess.
Okay, I want to sit down on this for just a second and ask the question broadly. Joe's got us off on, thinking about the boyars and Muscovy and how we can say that Russians were disconnected from Europe. But I just need a couple of, explanatory pieces that will help us know why that is and what that means. What does that mean they were disconnected from Europe, and why? Quickly. Kyle, go ahead. Kyle Coulter?
Yes, sir. I was just going to say, I feel like they were mainly disconnected because Russia geographically is in such a unique place due to like how large it is and how there's such a, like right in the middle between, what happened? Sorry. My thing cut out real quick. My like screen cut out, but they're right in the middle between Europe and Asia and the Middle East. They're just in such a huge area. I feel like it was more of an issue of just having that disconnectment because they didn't know which side to pull from. For example, when the boyards had like the Asian clothing, but the decision was ultimately made like at that point that everyone was going to speak French and everyone was going to start having those European ties. I think that was really the transition towards when they said, we're going to focus all our attention on this certain aspect of civilization rather than, you know, getting influenced by, you know, any other culture at the time.
Okay, well, let's be straight about something, though. This was not a choice anybody made other than Peter the Great. He decided. This is a force, okay? This is a life. This is like lightning from above. This is like the creator decreeing, if you will, that we're going to become more European. So this was not something that people chose to do. It was something they were forced to do, first of all. But no one's yet answered the question of why they were disconnected. I mean, there's some really big, important historical things here. Two I can think of, very, you know, briefly even. There's a couple of reasons why the Russians were not exposed to Europe. Why?
Professor, you'll have to help me pronounce the name, but Muscovy?
Praskovia?
No,
Muscovy. Muscovy,
Muscovy,
right.
there we go.
Yeah.
It was their church before all this. They were very isolated from the Renaissance while that was happening, and their church just wasn't letting them make literature, besides, you know, them not really being literate overall. And then they weren't making a lot of art other than what they had as a basis. They didn't have like still lifes, landscapes, stuff like that. And because of the church really bearing down and on them with all that, they weren't really moving forward, and they weren't really connecting with everyone else during the Renaissance.
Okay, you've mentioned two very important things in general, Victoria. You've mentioned the Russian Orthodox Church. Let's just say briefly, we'll get into it later, the Russian Orthodox Church is Eastern. It draws on all of the Eastern Christianity, not the Western Christianity, not the Reformation, not Catholicism. That's Western Orthodox religion, if you think about it. Catholicism is. And then the whole Protestant Reformation had already begun and was taking place when Peter decreed all of this. And that was not a historical experience that the Russians went through, in part because of the church. But as you also say, that means, and this is a second factor, that means that they also did not undergo the kinds of changes that Western Europe went through during the period of the Renaissance. And of course, the Renaissance is it's the discovery of the self. It's the discovery, the early discovery, if you will, of this notion of individual rights and the self, right? And so, and everything that goes along with the Renaissance, none of that theoretically was experienced by the Russians. And that's very important, so that when Peter decides to force them into this Europeanization, it is a shock, but it's also something that many of them have no conception of. And by the way, when a society or a culture doesn't get to percolate through what took hundreds of years in Europe, but has it forced on them all of a sudden, it's a cultural shock. It's a psychological shock. And the whole point that we're trying to make here, and that Figes is trying to make here, is that it was so shocking that they would eventually rebel against it. You know, after 100 years or so, these aristocrats that we're reading about would actually, begin to say, hey, we don't want to be Europeans, or we want to be Russians instead of Europeans. And that's when the whole thing about who are Russians begins. But the story starts with Peter declaring, with Peter making a plan, and with Peter, for lack of a better kind of explanation, how shall I say this, planning it down to the nth degree, where he tells them how to dress. They have to shave their beards. They have to wear breeches. They have to learn to speak French. They have to move to St. Petersburg and keep homes in St. Petersburg. Why? Because Peter's trying to build a court. By the way, whose court is he trying to emulate? Peter himself? Whose court is he trying to emulate? What great,
French.
well, but whose? Louis who? Louis the 14th, the great Sun King, right? The greatest ruler in Europe in, you know, from 1683 until 1715 or even earlier. Now that I think about it, 1660s through 1715. He wants Russia to be like France, and he wants it to be like Europe. He wants not just France, but he wants it to be like Europe, but he wants to model his court on that great court of Louis the 14th, okay? So by using the Sheremetyev, of course, we can illustrate the Petrine plan and how it was played out by noting how they had to move to St. Petersburg, how they accrued all of their wealth, but then how they had to spend it, if you will, right? So what happens is, in a very short time, in the space of just 50 years, the Sheremetyevs will go from being boyars, essentially, to European aristocrats on a scale that no other aristocrats in Europe could be aristocratic, right? I mean, think about the massive wealth. Think about, you know, the number of servants at Ostankina or at Kuskova, right? Think about that. So this is a shock, all right? Any other comments on that question? Questions?
Can I ask a general question?
Yes, you may.
So I know that, for example, like King Louis or the Louis in general, the divine right of kings was a really big thing in their rule, and I know that that was connected a lot to Catholicism. Was this type of philosophy also compatible with Eastern Orthodox, like in the religious movements in Russia?
Absolutely. I'm not sure that they referred to it as divine right, but it is divine right. Now, what Peter does, though, and this is very important, and I'm not sure we've come to it in our reading yet, but what Peter does is, in many respects, he secularizes Russia. He weakens the church. He creates a holy synod, which will essentially run the church, but it's a secular institution at kind of a national level. And remember that that Peter's not particularly Orthodox. He doesn't like the Orthodox Church. He hates Muscovy. He hates the old ancient culture of Russia, and anything that smacks of that, he's not going to want. So another very important part here of this story, is it Matt? Sue? Is your name Matt? I'm sorry, it's just M. Sue.
Yeah, sorry, didn't
That's
allow
all
me
right.
to rename myself. Matt,
No,
yeah,
that's
Matt
fine.
Matthew.
Right, I don't allow you to rename yourself. That's true. But I figured it was Matt. But anyway, by the way, are you related to Brandon?
Brandon Sue?
Yeah.
Possibly. Well, if it's spelled the same way, then there's pretty high likelihood.
All right. Well, a former student of mine from a few years ago, and I thought, oh, I wonder if I have his brother or something. But anyway, the point I was going to make is that Peter secularizes, for lack of a better term, Russia. And it's so shocking that these people called old believers, who were Russian Orthodox, but hyper kind of fundamentalist religious people, they went out by the thousands and locked themselves in churches and burned themselves to death because they thought it was the Antichrist. So it's an interesting part of the story, but the answer is that, you know, he even secularized the country, if you will. That's an important part too. I don't know if that answered your question or not, Matt. Did I answer your question, Matt?
Yeah, that was pretty comprehensive.
Well, I guess I should be able to do that. All right. Now, I don't have anything more to say about this first question. Is anyone burning in their bosom to say what you prepared to say? Just something we missed and you got to say it? All right, question number 2. Explain the relationship of the Russian nobility to the Tsar and the state, at least before 1762. Who wants a crack at that before I ask somebody?
I can.
Go, Victoria.
Okay. Previously, the nobility derived power and wealth from the favor of the czar. And it I it read as the nobles were legally defined as being the czar's slaves. They could be gifted land and serfs, but if they were even slightly thought of being disloyal, they could have all that taken from them and be demoted from the nobility. Materially, they were not very different from the serfs, and many of the nobility actually could not read or add up sums.
So again, it's not a nice word to use, but backwards is the word that frequently pops up in the literature. We don't mean to speak disparagingly, but these people were not all that educated. They weren't all that sophisticated. They had to become educated, had to become sophisticated. But let me add that nonetheless, Victoria, based upon what you just said, all of which was accurate, by the way, nonetheless, it should be noted that there was still this table of ranks, which theoretically established 14, well, it didn't theoretically, it actually established 14 levels of status. But theoretically, this was supposed to be about people gaining their position by talent. This is another kind of thing that Peter wanted to bring in from Europe. But in many respects, the table of ranks didn't work that way. And what it did is it created this pecking order about which people could be obsessed and were obsessed, right? And so interestingly, it's almost ironic, I think, that Peter wants to reconfigure society to do away with status or to do away with, you know, the boyars and their privilege. But what happens instead is a system gets established that really doesn't bring people of talents to the top, but rather it's just another kind of social hierarchy. And it creates a kind of obsession, you know, I mean, 14 different uniforms and all of that kind of stuff. And I think that's important to note also, that the relationship of the Russian nobility to the Tsar was still very close. He didn't create a free society. He kind of enslaved them, as you said, Victoria, but they had to do what they had to do. There were very precise rules about, you know, about who could do what, and about what people could do this and other people couldn't do that, and who could sit and who could stand and all of that kind of stuff. And it was constantly a part of this noble culture, right? Reinforced, as it were. All right, anybody else on answer B? Did we miss anything? It's a good start. These are things we'll be going over again. All right, what about this question in section 3? What do we learn from this section about the life of serfs, the so-called creative ones in particular? In what ways did they contribute to the high culture of the Europeanized aristocracy? Briefly, who wants to stab at this one? Got a couple minutes left.
The creative serfs were very integral to their high society, right? Because they were trained, they were sent to all these places to learn how to create this aura of Europeanism in Russia. But a lot of them, they still had the same power or same duties as regular serfs. Like the Argonovs, were described how he had the duty of interior decorating inside of the mansion, but he'd still have to do regular duties like oh god, what was he had to do? But yeah, and they still get flogged and beaten and
right. So in other words, the question is, Joe, did they cease to be serfs when they became world-class artists or opera singers, or?
No, they were still directly owned by their masters.
That's exactly right. Notice this. It's an important point. Talent and greatness does not give these people their freedom. They have to be emancipated, and very few of them were. And in the case of the Sheremetyevs, they had thousands of these kinds of serfs who were highly trained, very good at what they did. I mean, think of anything that needed to be done on an estate, and it was the serfs that were doing them, and it was highly talented and highly trained serfs that were doing those things, but they remained serfs, right? They may be paid well. The chef was the highest paid chef in Europe, or something like that, right? 850 rubles a year, whatever the equivalent of that is, but paid better than chefs in Paris and London, right? But this also reveals something else about these aristocrats. It's not quite this question, but these people were profligate in their spending. And I want you to think about that, because their wealth, not unlike in America, but differently, their wealth was built upon the backs of people who were not free, people who were owned. Now, they were treated differently than American chattel slaves, and we'll get into that, but I want you to see that these people were not free. These people were enslaved, as Victoria said. And by the way, everyone in Russia, theoretically, was at some level of being enslaved, although obviously, you know, the Sheremetyevs weren't living like slaves, but the point is their status and their wealth came by virtue of being subjugated to the throne, all right? Finally, someone tell us, number B, what is significant about the relationship between Count Nikolai Sheremetyev and the serf Praskovia? Who wants to tackle that one? We'll give you the last couple minutes here. What does it reinforce? This might be an interesting way of thinking about significance, by the way. What does the story reveal to us about important cultural stuff in Russia? Who's that?
Oh, it's me. I thought it just showed how much control they really had over the serfs. Like Nikolai, right?
This was it Nikolai? No, this is Pyotr, I think. But anyway, or is it Nikolai? I don't remember.
It's Nikolai.
I think it was Nikolai.
Nikolai, all right. Thank you.
He literally he stops her wedding, her marriage to another man, and just decide. And it shows like how much control they have. Like you have harems that they have control over.
Right.
But they just say, no, you're mine now. And they'll just marry them off when they feel like. And it's also just sad because like it shows like how he doesn't believe, he's afraid of the backlash he'll get for marrying a serf.
Okay, so you mentioned at least two things, Joe. You mentioned, first of all, this is misogyny, right? I mean, this is misogyny on a mass scale, where male landowners get to do whatever in the hell they want with whomever they want, right? Harems, or in this case, he can simply say, sorry, she can't marry who her father wants her to marry. That's not freedom for the serfs, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this massive, it's sexual assault when you stop and think about it. It's systematic rape, for lack of a better term.
His handkerchief stories?
What's that?
His handkerchief?
Yeah, I mean,
handkerchief and
right. I mean, this is
later.
Right. And then you bring up a second thing, and that is that this dude actually falls in love with her, and suddenly you got a real love story, and he wants to, and indeed marries her, but it costs him everything socially, everything, right? Because he's married a serf. He has the audacity to marry a serf. But there's another interesting part here, and it is, what do we learn about how Praskovia probably felt about this?
It was all bad.
She felt awful.
Yeah.
She considered it that she considered herself to have sinned.
Right. That last, that note that she wrote is filled with shame. Right? Now, she would have been, how shall I say this, predisposed towards that because of the way that Russian Orthodoxy practices religion and encourages, guilt and shame to be embraced, shall we say. but she was a religious person, very religious. But the thing I wanted you guys to see is that I kind of sensed that she felt dirty. You know, that she really felt like she was dirty. And the reason she felt like she was dirty is because of the system she lived in, where this guy could basically, you know, do what he wanted to. And so that even after he falls in love with her and seems to be faithful to her, notice how it impacts their relationship. And of course, we don't know if she ever, we never find out if she really loved him, right? We only hear that he loved her. So, all right. Well, that's all we got time for. So I think we did a good job. We're kind of, you know, moving into this. Clearly, some of you are willing to speak up and are well prepared, and I thank you for that. I should have the breakout rooms done by Wednesday. If not, I'll let you know. I should have the so-called intro lecture up probably by tomorrow. I'll let you know. I'm a little bit behind, but I'll be catching up, and then I'll be ahead. And also, let me just say that sometime today, I'll put some announcement up just reminding you of what you need to do this week. Not necessarily you guys, because you're paying attention, you're in class, but it's for people who have not been able to come to class yet. I need to kind of keep up with them too. So it will be a regular practice at the beginning of each week for me just to put up something on Canvas reminding everybody of what it is that they need to do. So there are going to be a lot more announcements in this way of doing things than there normally would be, because all of this stuff that I'm saying right now and what I said at the beginning of the course, of course, I would have just handled in the classroom, right? Okay, so I want to encourage you guys to stick with this. We're gonna develop a rhythm. I do want to hear more people speak. A lot of you kind of, you know, didn't speak up today, and I don't want it to be that way, but I understand it. But anyway, I want to wish you guys a great day. If you have any questions, contact me. And, you know, got office hours tomorrow and all that, blah, blah, blah. Are there any questions before I go? All right. As the Russians say, до свидания. We'll see you next time, okay?
До свидания.
До свидания.